Okay, everybody settle down. Can we just have a little bit of silence for a moment? I just want to say hi to all the people in Serpico. Can you hear us in there? No, you're not in Serpico, you're in Manning. This is Manning where I am right now. And Serpico, give us a loud cheer. Okay, all right. And you folks way in the back in Olson, can you hear us? All right. They're a little closer. You guys down on the first floor, how about you? I hear something. Okay. There are people on the first floor at the entrance to the hotel spilled out into the street right now.
Oh my God.
Not kidding.
They should just publicly broadcast this outside.
There are taxis queuing up. It's a whole big. It's a good mess, though. It's a good mess. Okay, so I know there are some of you who felt you didn't applaud enough for Daniel's amazing speech. Here he is again.
There's Snowden.
I also would like to introduce Trevor Tim from the Freedom of the Press Foundation, founder of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. He's going to be here. He will have selected some questions from Twitter that you guys have submitted. And I guess this is a good time to remind people on the press, this is not a press conference, so the questions we're going to ask Edward later come from our attendees, and hopefully there'll be questions that you're interested in as well. Please just follow our guidelines and everything will be cool. And that's, oh yes, I almost forgot. We have a third panelist who will be joining us from Russia, one of my real heroes, and I think many people in this room, many people in the hacker community, many people in America. Edward Snowden, welcome.
So I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing the stage, but I think I can hear Dan's microphone. I want to start out by saying to Dan Ellsberg, thank you for everything you've done, for all of your service, both in the government and outside of the government. Everything you did for us as a nation, as a society. You have given so many, so much, and told us the truth about what our government was doing at a time when the truth was very hard to get. And I have to say, I watched a documentary about your life as I was grappling with these issues myself. And it had a deep impact and really shaped my thinking. So thank you for everything you've done.
And I see you've shaved since I last saw you. I have to tell you, you didn't have to do that for this audience.
Well, luckily, I've got plenty of black t-shirts. But I do not have the Keith Alexander brand dad jeans. I'll save those for DEF CON.
Yeah.
So, I'm going to try to stay largely out of the way and let these guys talk, but I think there's a few topics that we'd like to cover. And to start with, I was hoping Dan could describe what it felt like the first time he heard about Edward Snowden, his feelings on hearing his name and seeing what he had given the world, and if his feelings have changed since and how he's grown to feel about Edward Snowden.
I can tell you exactly what I felt. Hope, actually, which had not been in great supply for me recently. When I saw this name of this conference, I had mixed feelings about it. My feelings of hope go up and down, although they haven't been too high. And no question, I felt that when Chelsea Manning was revealed. I used to ask in a way, how often do you need a Pentagon Papers, which is a massive disclosure that is unequivocal of documents that really shows, one document doesn't do it, as Ed knows. And then they can say, well, we changed that the next day. That was just some particular little department, some low-level person originated that or something. So what you really need is a massive stuff, as in the Pentagon Papers, that shows, no, this is what they said the next day and the day after that, and here was the official policy, and so forth. And I waited 40 years to hear that. And so I was pretty much losing hope that there would be anybody inside who was willing to risk his freedom, his life or her life and freedom, to put out what needed to be put out. Because if you put out a lot of stuff, and I want to get into this with you, Ed, it's technically, you have to be something of a specialist to put out a lot of stuff and not be identified. So I was feeling not hopeful that it would come. Then just 3 years after Manning comes Snowden. So there's no question. I thought it is possible. And in fact, Ed, you once told me that you hoped, among other things, to show that one could do this and be successful. And I'd be interested to hear, actually, from you what your measure. There's no question in my mind you have been successful, but what you had in mind when you wanted to show that people could do this. Because after all, you are out of the country, etc.
Well, so there's a lot of things to address there. I mean, that's a big topic. But you said something that I want to respond to first, which was, you kind of touched on technology. You talked about how people recently are specialists. They're able to use specialist skills to gather information that's tremendously important to the public, but we've been denied access to it. And they're able to publish that and get it around the world before anyone's able to stop, before they're able to kill the story, and before they're able to basically shut the public out of the room of government. You know, they sort of divorce us from our democracy. And the key for me there is that technology empowers dissent. This is something we've seen again and again, and people forget this because they think about it only in modern times. They only think about it at the recent examples. They think about me, they think about Manning, they think about other people who followed in the same sort of thread, but they forget that technology actually enables you. People forget about the fact that you were, in a garage with a Xerox machine. A copy machine might not seem like a killer app to a lot of people, but that enabled you to get this back to the public. And the same Xerox machine that gave you that gave us Samizdat in the former Soviet bloc. And what that tells me, and what I think is important for our society, and I don't just mean in the United States, I mean around the world, is to recognize that technology empowers individuals, it empowers voices, it empowers democracy in a way that can turn one man into a movement, or a woman into a world power. And that has fundamentally changed the way that we relate to our government, and more importantly, the way our government relates to us. They say when people fear the government, we have tyranny. But when the government fears people, we have democracy, we have liberty, we have freedom. And I think that's very true, and we see that more and more. When the government has been left sort of in the dark, even when we have whistleblowers who come up and stand up at great risk to bring things to the public, people like Bill Binney, Thomas Drake, Ed Loomis, who end up getting, these guys get pulled out of the shower, naked at gunpoint in front of their families. Their lives are destroyed, their careers are destroyed. They're discredited, they said they're disgruntled. There's these broad campaigns brought against them, but they didn't have hard evidence. They did everything right. They went through the system destroyed them, the system buried them. And we see this happen again and again. Something very important happened today. A lot of people haven't seen it yet. In the Washington Post, there's an opinion article by a former State Department official who has basically said he's bound by classification. He had to get the the article screened by the government, to redact any classified information before it could publish it. But the Washington Post ran it, and it basically said, Executive Order 12333, which is one of the signals intelligence authorities, which allows the United States to intercept, basically, communications that are occurring overseas, is being used to collect incredible amounts of communications, not just on people around the world, not just innocents everywhere, but specifically on Americans, which is precisely what the United States government has said they are not doing. And this is the kind of thing that's illustrated, because what he revealed was explosive. It should be on the front page of every newspaper. But instead, it's an opinion article on one newspaper because there's not clear, irrefutable evidence that brings the president to the podium, that brings the Congress to, the press, and says, we have to have a national conversation where the public is given back its seat at the table of government. And we, as a society, are given the opportunity to decide where the lines should be drawn, not a few officials sitting behind closed doors. And I think that is a new power that technology has given us over the last 100 years that is increasing in frequency, strength, magnitude. And if we pair that with a responsibility to use it appropriately, to police ourselves the way our technology grows, and not sleepwalk into new protocols, into new usages, into new applications for these things, but we really think about the implications of putting, ARFIDs in our sneakers and our washing machines and the things we buy at the grocery store, we will have not a dystopian future, but we will have a democracy in which citizens around the world, in every country, are empowered, regardless of the policies of their government. And we, at the very minimum, will know the truth of our world and the truth of our governments, and it will not be able to be hidden from us anymore.
So Ed, you mentioned two NSA whistleblowers who came before you, Thomas Drake, who's in the front row here, and Bill Binney, who spoke at the last H.O.P.E 2 years ago. And of course, here sits Daniel Ellsberg, the most famous whistleblower in U.S. history. Were you aware of their stories prior to what you did? How familiar were you with the Pentagon Papers and Dan Ellsberg? And did you learn any lessons from them? And are there lessons future whistleblowers can learn from you?
Absolutely. I mean, I followed this closely. I think everybody in the intelligence community did. Because what people forget is that, we in the public, we see these stories. They come on the news, the Justice Department, the President, all the talking heads. They say these guys are bad guys. They say they risk the country. They say they're, spies. They've been charged under the Espionage Act. They did bad things. But when you look at what happened, when you look at the bad faith the government used in their case, particularly against Thomas Drake, which eventually collapsed, and they dropped the Espionage Act charges and basically agreed to call it a day. You've got to remember that inside the intelligence community, they're trumpets these things. They're holding these guys up as examples to say, look, if you say what's going on, if you step out of line, even if you're doing it for the right reasons, even if you're doing it the right way, there will be repercussions. They talk about internal channels and whatnot, but these guys used internal channels. And people like Thomas Drake, they ended up getting indicted. And this is something that I paid very close attention to and I learned a great deal from. And I think it reminds us that, the Founding Fathers, they didn't fight a revolution to have a right to sort of internal processes. The Supreme Court argued this principle. Some internal secret policy is not democracy, and that's not checks and balances. That's bureaucracy. If we're going to have democracy, if we're going to have an enlightened citizen, if we're going to be able to actually provide the consent of the government, we have to know what's going on. We have to know at least the broad outlines of our policies, and we can't have the government shut us out from every action that they're doing. Now, that doesn't mean we need to know the name of every single surveillance target that's out there. We need to know the details of every particular operation against every factory that's here, there, or anywhere. But we have a right, as Americans and as members of the global community, to know the broad outlines of government policies that have a significant impact on our lives. And I think that's something that Tom Drake showed me how to do the right way.
So, Dan, my next question for you. Oftentimes, Ed's biggest critics often invoke your name, and they invoke it in a positive way and try to contrast what you did with what Edward did. Can you talk about that a little bit? How does that make you feel? Do you agree with them? Do you disagree with them? The most recent was actually Secretary of State John Kerry, who said that you were a hero, but Ed was not. And so, can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, this bullshit in a way started with Barack Obama when somebody actually took the occasion to ask him about Manning here in San Francisco. I can say here where I come from, in San Francisco, and said, "Well, didn't Chelsea Manning, then Bradley, do exactly what Ellsberg did?" You know, and well, he could have answered that various ways. What he said was, Ellsberg's material was classified in a different manner. Well, that was true in a way. As I mentioned earlier, everything that Manning put out was secret or less, and everything I put out was top secret. That was the difference. And I think the person asking the question didn't pursue that. And of course, in your case, we'll come back to that, but in your case, higher than top secret, you know, communications intelligence stuff, which I would earlier have said didn't deserve to be put out until you see what it says. And then you see it's evidence of criminality and should not be subject to criminal prosecution for revealing it, even though it is higher than top secret. So since then, that was with Manning, and I found then, that was starting in 2010, that thanks to Manning and now to you, I'm getting more favorable publicity than in 40 years, because suddenly people who were all for putting me in prison for life before now realize that I was really a very good guy. I was the good whistleblower, and so I'm totally, of course, rejected this from the beginning. And I didn't want to be a foil for showing up badly to people that I totally admired, you know, and identified with, because there have been lots of leakers, whistleblowers, and I appreciate them all. Ones who put out information that should have been known. They're anonymous. I don't know their names on the whole, but the difference here, to me, with Manning and you, was that each showed very clearly, as I had felt 40 years ago, a willingness to put out enough material that was going to really be serious, put us in prison for life. When I read that Manning had said, as I used to say, to Adrian Lamo, the wrong guy to confide in, that he was willing to go to prison for life or even be executed, I said to myself, I have waited 40 years to hear somebody say that. That's the way I felt 40 years ago, and it's taken this long. But so I felt immediately an identification with him. Obviously, in your case, in Manning's case, in my case, we all have different backgrounds. We're different in many ways, but we have the same access, interestingly, you know, comparable, and different kinds of things. So I identified with them, and I couldn't bear to hear me getting good press from the Secretary of State on the grounds that my motives were different. And for example, you mentioned, you know, some of the specifics here. Well, Ellsberg just put out information that was historical, you know, 3 years old at the most recent. Well, that's because I didn't have the most recent. If I had had the current documents, I would not have bothered to put out history. My interest was not in setting the record straight. My interest was in ending an ongoing war, helping to end an ongoing war. And for that, I would much have preferred to put out current documents, which I, at that moment, didn't have access to. Very few people did in the government, even in the White House. It was a big secret what Nixon was really up to, including nuclear threats. And I hoped that my documents would show a pattern that extended into the present. And I failed. Hardly anybody was willing to extrapolate and say, well, Ellsberg has shown that 4 previous presidents lied in the same way, escalated in the same way, made the same kind of secret threats, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, but it ended with those. It ended before Nixon. So I thought maybe they'll figure out that maybe the current president is doing the same. No, It took documents, and I didn't have that. So for years, I've been saying to people, it's got to be with documents, even though that increases their risk. Well, people know that basically, but they weren't willing to take the risk, I'm sorry to say, and couldn't do it honestly. So then Manning came out with his millions, hundreds of thousands actually, of cables, and then you with documents. And it's like Mordecai Vanunu in Israel with photographs that Israel had a nuclear program and even an H.O.P.E that they weren't willing to admit. And it took those documents which took the risk. So what I was saying is, I saw it right away, without having met you, without having met Manning, that this is someone who I identify with. And at the same time, new heroes. He said, what was my feeling? I heard Snowden's name. He said, well, I have a new hero. Mm-hmm. And so, thank you.
If I could actually follow up on that, I think there's a really important point there that hasn't been real well addressed in the media. And that was, you said you acted, not to reveal a specific illegality, but to end a war, to basically correct failures of policies that were costing lives, that were costing us the future of our country at a critical moment where things could be changed, where we could step back sort of from the brink and enjoy a better society. And I think people need to remember that these stories that are being published by journalists, the journalists are working together with their editors, with their institutions, to really analyze whether these things are in the public interest, whether they can benefit us as a society to know, and not publish things that are just, gossip or they don't have a significant justification for going in the public domain. Since these stories were revealed, we not only learned sort of the new truth of our world, about the fact that all of our communications are being intercepted, collected, analyzed, and stored automatically. And that means that all of our ideas, all of our thoughts, all of our expressions, all of our associations, who we talk to, who we meet, who we love, who we hate, all of these things are now subordinated to the officials, to the policies of a few guys behind closed doors. And we don't know, we can't hold them to account. They don't answer to us. They don't even answer to the full body of Congress. There are only 8 members in Congress, they're called the Gang of 8, who get fully briefed on these intelligence programs. And interestingly, the intelligence committees that are supposed to oversee these programs, these guys who have access to classified information, they receive more money from actually all of them. Every single member of this committee receives money from the top 20 intelligence companies in the United States. And they also receive more money from these companies than any other members in Congress. In fact, a single one of these congressmen, his name is Dutch Ruppersberger, received over 350 grand from these companies alone. That's not all of his donations, that's just from these top 20 companies. So when we think about the revelations, when we think about the fact that we've learned what's going on, when we have an ability to debate, when we have the ability to correct this overreach, when we have the ability to protest unconstitutional activities that never should have begun, but we also have a broader civic understanding of how our government works. We see that the most senior officials in government have been lying under oath. They've been making false statements to Congress, for example, James Clapper. But not just Congress. It's not just the lies we know of. There are other ones that didn't get as much attention. For example, the Department of Justice, the Solicitor General of the United States, he lied to the Supreme Court twice in writing. And it was in the New York Times. But, this didn't become the front page news that, persists and we respond to. But it was a direct revelation that came out on the newspaper on June 7th, was when we found out that people had been surveilled. To dial back, because it gets technical in terms of surveillance authorities, what happened is the government was using warrantless surveillance to collect evidence to justify warrant applications for warranted surveillance. That's a violation of both the 4th and the 5th Amendment. for people who are keeping score. And what's interesting is they didn't report this to the courts, and they didn't report this to defendants. But then they later told the Supreme Court that they were, and it turned out that was untrue. If we don't know these kind of things, we don't know our government. We have to be able to know not just what governments do, but how they act, in order to decide how closely we need to scrutinize their behaviors. And if we didn't have whistleblowers like you, like Tom Drake, and like everybody else who's come forward at tremendous risks, we would have a less open, less free, and less accountable society. And because of that, I think it's worth taking risks to do this. And it's not just what's illegal. You know, the scandal is what is legal. The scandal is what's happening every day, the unconstitutional activities that are still occurring right now. The fact that we look at, for example, one of the things that's been talked about a lot is how to fix this. The fact that the least controversial program in terms of do we end it, does this do nothing, is Section 215. And Section 215 of the Patriot Act basically says that, hey, we can collect the call records, metadata records from everybody in the country, regardless of whether they are suspected of any crime, any wrongdoing. And we have to ask, you know, what does that do? Why are they doing this? What is the value? Because you encrypt communications, right? They don't get anything out of that. This is just the signaling records. This is like what a private eye collects. Who you meet, who you talk to, when it happened, where it was at, not the exact content of what was said during these calls. So encryption protects the content, but we forget about associations. And that's what this is about. These programs like Section 215, mass surveillance in general, is not about surveilling you. It's not about surveilling me. It's about surveilling us, collectively. It's about watching the company for everybody in the country and on a global scale. This is basically a big data program which provides the raw data that can then be analyzed, it can be filtered, it can be subjected to rules, for example, like this in score, that says everything you do is being analyzed, it's being weighted, it's being measured. And that's without regard to whether or not you've done anything wrong. So when people say, you know, why does this matter? Well, why do I care? You know, why should I get up off the couch? It's because, again, when we think about this in terms of the 4th and 5th Amendment, you know, it's an unreasonable seizure because there's nothing to justify doing it. It happens in advance of any criminal suspicion. Or the due process violations under the 5th Amendment, where the government is basically saying, we're going to use warrantless surveillance to collect evidence to then secretly use to get a warrant application. Or the First Amendment violations of our freedom to associate. Right? Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, or our right to associate, to enjoy the company of whoever we want. If you let go of your rights for a moment, you lost them for a lifetime. And that's why this matters, is because it happened and we didn't know about it. We weren't told about it. In the post-September 11th period, we had programs stood up like Stellarwind that collected all of our internet metadata, all of our calling metadata, and it was creating a massive, deep, robust data set that allows us to look at connections and actually programmatically analyze the connections of everybody at every place all the time. And I think that's not what this country is about. I think that's a fundamentally un-American thing. And I think we, the people, you in this room right now, have both the means and the capability to help build a better future by encoding our rights into the programs and protocols upon which we rely every day. And that's what a lot of my future work is going to be involved in, and I hope that you will join me in the Freedom of the Press and every other organization in making that a reality.
So I should mention, both Dan Ellsberg and now Ed Snowden are on Freedom of the Press Foundation's board of directors, and we really want to make it our goal to help journalists and sources and everyone connect in a way that can be protected from the government's eyes and essentially protect our right to privacy and freedom of speech. And so I think that brings me to my next question for Ed. and this comes from one of the Ask Snowden questions on Twitter, is what specifically can designers and developers and others working in technology start to do to make things better? And are there specific examples out there that you would like to see people follow?
So when I talk about this, it's always difficult because it is entirely dependent on the threat model of the individual who's operating. Gam in the home has a different set of priorities than somebody who's working to report on the malfeasance of a deeply irresponsible government and an authoritarian regime. And so generally when I talk about this, I say encryption. I say encryption, 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 because it's an important first step that denies the government access to anything more typically than a suspicion, which is drawn from association. But when we talk about how we fix this stuff for the future, we've got to realize that association is often the problem. It doesn't end at encryption, it starts at encryption. Because if you don't think about the links, sort of the signals that are happening, when I email you, and the government can't read the content of the communication, but they go, why is an employee of the government who was at work on Thursday at the Central Intelligence Agency or the National Security Agency or the FBI, who works on programs which would be deeply embarrassing to the government, why are they contacting someone at the Freedom of the Press Foundation or the Washington Post or the New York Times? And so we get tools like SecureDrop, which are good because they allow us to use mixed routing networks like Tor to sort of obfuscate our direct network path. But we've got to think about the fact that today, if people are connecting through a phone, that's not super helpful because the phone, for example, sees that you're connecting to Tor. It sees you're a Tor user. A good example of this, really a bad example in terms of OPSEC, is this recent American spy who was discovered in Germany. He was apparently alleged in the newspapers spying for the United States against Germany. He then, I guess, wasn't satisfied with what was going on. So he said, hey, I'm going to shop myself to what I think are the Russians, because he got an email. He was using Gmail, and he got an email that purported to be the Russian embassy. And they said, hey, you want to sell some documents? He said, oh, yeah, sure. And he sent them 3 classified documents. Now, this is an email. I don't know whether it's encrypted or not encrypted. That hasn't really been covered in detail. But the key is the adversary that was on the distant end of the communication, in this case, German counterintelligence for his model, although he's actually allegedly a spy. He's not interested in public interest. He's interested in money. Is the fact that when he did this, he was the only one who had access to these documents who was out of the office at the time. He took the day off to send this email. So again, we're not talking about the most sophisticated guy in the world, but this is the kind of thing you have to worry about in terms of how do governments discover their adversaries. And the same techniques they use to discover spies, they use to discover journalists. The Risen case and the Rosen case, both